Morning. I think we can start. Welcome everyone to our series of seminars, Difficult Heritage, organized by our PhD program in History, Art History and Archaeology at the University of Genoa, and our research center for the history of racism and anti-racism in modern Italy. I am really delighted to have as our guest today, this afternoon, one of, I think, the most prominent and I would say inspiring scholars of the relationship between architecture and city planning, urban design, and fascism and colonialism, and Professor Mia Furrer. Hi, Mia. Good morning, and thank you for having accepted our invitation and for being here at such an early hour in the morning in California. Thank you. Few words of presentation. Professor Mia Fowler is department chair and associate professor of Italian studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She is a cultural anthropologist who has combined field work and archival research in her studies of architecture and city planning in the Italian colonies between 1869 and 1943. Her book on the subject, Moderns Abroad, Architecture, Cities and Italian Imperialism, published by Routledge in 2007, won the International Planning History Society Book Prize in 2008. She is also the co-editor with Ruth Bengiat of Italian Colonialism, published by Palgrave in 2005. Since then, she has published articles on the aftermath of Italian colonialism in Libya and Eritrea, and on museum representations of Mussolini. She's currently preparing a book on Italy Pontine Marshes, the Agropontino, as a site of fascist memory and monuments from the 1930s settlements to the present. The title of the presentation, of Mia Fowler's presentation this afternoon, is a question, actually, difficult how Italy's own perplexed treatments traces. And the title is particularly fascinating, I think, as it actually challenges and it problematizes the very conceptual core, reference core of our series, that is Sharon MacDonald, Difficult Heritage. So I'm particularly interested in this presentation, and thank you once again, Mia, and the digital floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I see friendly, familiar faces and new friendly faces as well. So thank you very much. A quick extra introduction. Thank you for your generous introduction, of course, Francesco. And I'm going to add a couple of things. So I'm going to be reading today. Usually when I give presentations, I speak live. So this is a little unusual for me because I've written this piece that is going to be a chapter in a forthcoming volume edited by Carmen Belmonte. And the title of that book is Difficult Heritage, ? The Afterlife of Colonial and Fascist Architecture, Monuments and Works of Art in Contemporary Italy. And it comes from a convegno that Carmen organized in 2019, which seems so long ago now just because of the pandemic. Anyway, so this is my contribution to that volume, which is why it's a written text. It's almost the final version. So I appreciate your patience listening to reading. The other thing I want to say as a kind of preliminary is I recognize that most of you are art historians, and whereas in the book I'm preparing, there is visual analysis, this talk is a little bit less about visual analysis and much more about the theoretical and comparative apparatus that we bring to discussing fascist era monuments and legacies of fascism in Italy today. Okay, so I think I have control of my slides. I do. This is very exciting. Okay, so let me begin. I'm always excited when it works. Okay, so this is Nuremberg. Most of you, maybe all of you, will recognize this right away. The notion of cultural heritage has not always been used to encompass politically sensitive vestiges or sites that incite conflict over who writes history and who owns public spaces. Instead, for a long time, it was expected to unify national and civic sentiment, maybe especially in Great Britain and France, which is why the canonical studies that we have are largely about Great Britain and France. And I'm thinking of Françoise Choët as well as David Lowenthal. By now, though, the notion of cultural heritage is thoroughly embroiled with unresolved fights over what to do with monuments and other remains of past systems of rule. Disputes in Europe over how or even whether to commemorate the fascist, National Socialist, and Soviet regimes' triumphs and defeats reignite periodically as each new generation must come to terms with the atrocities of the Holocaust, World War II, and colonialism that are inescapably part of its own country's history. Just as in American clashes over Confederate monuments, the word heritage or its equivalent is invoked throughout with competing claims, but a general agreement that heritage is meaningful and confers certain rights on those who have a claim to it. One of the most inspired tools in discussing how such clashes can be resolved is anthropologist Sharon Macdonald's concept of, quote, difficult heritage, drawn from her research at Nuremberg in Germany, a site that by definition can never be cleansed of its National Socialist associations. Host to the Nazis' annual rallies, including their Congress meetings from 1933 to 1938, for which the city's immense parade grounds were built. Excuse me, Nuremberg is exponentially symbolic, being inflected with both the heights of Nazi power, which you can see in most of these images, and the global visibility of Nazi failure. The 1934 laws that began the implementation of Hitler's anti-Semitic agenda are still known as the Nuremberg Laws. The Führer's yearly arrival in the old town of Nuremberg, the processional path that he and his entourage took through the medieval heart of the city, the balcony of the hotel room where he stayed, were permanently captured in Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 film, Triumph of the Will, and you can visit them today. For all of these reasons, the Allies selected Nuremberg as the location for the post-war trials, see the picture on the lower right hand, that put the judgment of the Holocaust's perpetrators on display. Even more than Berlin, this was the city most saturated with the Third Reich's triumphalism. And here, marking the two new legislative concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity, the regime's end was enacted once and for all. The documentation center that one can visit today sits nestled within the outsized former Congress Hall, which you can see in the upper right hand. Macdonald's rich ethnographic work has shown how those in charge at several levels, meaning bureaucrats, exhibit designers, local politicians, and so on, made their decisions, and how visitors have responded to the resulting exposition of all that took place in Nazi-era Nuremberg. One aspect of Macdonald's book, which was published in 2009, is to establish the impossibility of satisfying all the stakeholders. There's no way to render the multiple meanings of Nuremberg correctly and definitively from the perspective of all concerned. In fact, Macdonald uses the word difficult more often, although not absolutely exclusively, to describe the problem of doing justice to the many facets of this terrible heritage, rather than to characterize the heritage per se. In an earlier article of 2006, Macdonald had called the heritage at Nuremberg a different word, undesirable, meaning, in her words, heritage that the majority of the population would prefer not to have. She added, this is a further quotation, the very fact of designating the buildings as heritage signaled a new consciousness of them as signaled a new consciousness of them as historically significant and as part of a historical record, even though this was a record that many in Germany would have preferred to forget. So here I just want to point out the two images at the bottom here are images I took during my visit in 2019. And you could spend a couple of hours just studying the interior of the documentation center, but I do want to notice the graphics and how they have solved, if you think of it that way, the problem of how you display the immense total rule, in a sense, of the Reich, all while not valorizing it and not wanting to repeat its triumphality. Right. So you show pictures of the thousands and thousands of troops assembled. You use black, red, and white graphics. Anyway, these are things to ponder, but I'll carry on. This must be underscored. The heritage of Nuremberg is straightforwardly undesirable. This almost all Germans would agree on, as there is no opacity at all regarding the events that took place there and what they signified, or about official mainstream German views of the Nazi regime. What has been relatively difficult instead is staging the representations involved to the satisfaction of the greatest possible number of parties. It is the fraught realm of interactions in which people do not necessarily agree and may have to reach hard negotiated compromises. MacDonald refines her use of the term difficult. Now we're back in her book of 2009. She explains that her approach is to, this is a quotation, her approach is to explore quote unquote difficult heritage as a historical and ethnographic phenomenon and as a particular kind of quote assemblage, she puts that in quotes, rather than to establish it as an analytical category. This means looking at how heritage is assembled, both discursively and materially, at the various players involved, at what they may experience as awkward and problematic, and the ways in which they negotiate that. She adds, my approach here is not concerned with presumed shared mental patterns, but addresses the social and cultural situations and frames in which heritage and difficult heritage is assembled and negotiated. That's the end of the quotation. In my essay, I argue for a clarification of how we use the expression difficult heritage as it applies to the handling of the fascist past within Italy. This is not to say that Italians do not find their fascist past difficult, but that how it is difficult for Italians should be distinguished from the ways in which the Nazi past is difficult for Germans. Starting from the dissimilarities between how the war ended in each country, Germany was roundly defeated and then carved up by external powers, whereas Italians' Guerra Civile of 1943 to 1945 left permanent internal rancors that have shaped the political landscape ever since. Italian society as a whole has not settled on a unifying narrative of the kind aimed for and largely produced, in contrast, by Germany's Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Correspondingly, to this day, Italy has no state-sanctioned museum representation or other official didactic exposition in film or memorials, for example, regarding fascism or the war, leaving ample room for mixed feelings, alternative histories, and fanciful interpretations. The very setting in which MacDonald did her research, a documentation center, has no Italian counterpart in which the difficulties or disagreements and the benefits of compromise can arise. As a starting point, then, we cannot even draw direct comparisons between what MacDonald described as difficult heritage assemblage in the German context and, on the other hand, any parallel Italian institutional setting. It may be helpful, though, to consider that Italy has some important commonalities with Japan, where ambiguity characterizes the recollection of World War II, including, maybe especially, the country's defeat. In the words of sociologist Akiko Hashimoto, so now I'm going to read a long quotation, Japan's war memories are much more varied than the single caricature image of quote unquote amnesia depicted by Western media. I suggest that there is no quote collective memory in Japan, rather multiple memories of war and defeat with different moral frames coexisting and vying for legitimacy. Japan's project to recover its moral foothold in the long wake of its calamitous defeat is fraught with deep fissures among stakeholders who embrace diverse perspectives and goals. The carriers of memory, Japanese intellectuals, educators, politicians, lawyers, commentators, media critics, activists, and others who retell the past, assign different meanings to the national fall, complicating the prospect of forging a unified national meta-narrative. That's the end of the quotation. An Italian version of what Hashimoto calls different moral frames is at the heart of the impasse preventing Italian society at large and Italian institutions in particular from assembling representations of fascism, the cult of Mussolini, and World War II. The consequence is a vacuum of official representation, which prevents narrative tools from developing. There is, therefore, a limited vocabulary with which to debate the pros and cons of the fascist past. Over the long term, this de facto freeze on narrative work in the public sphere has helped to sustain an inclination in practice to leave representative buildings and monuments in place, perhaps waiting for occasional pressures to make irreversible decisions about them to pass. It is this inertia that I discuss further on as a distinguishing trait of how Italy has handled its fascist past so far. First, though, I want to add to the comparisons I've already made that the density of traces of fascism in Italy's built environment is far greater than its equivalent in Germany. Fascism's physical infrastructure is so omnipresent that Italians are typically desensitized and very often even oblivious to its historical origins and political connotations. There is simply not a city or a town in Italy without a reminder, an essential structure, an emblem of the regime. And when a very large proportion of your schools and your apartment buildings and your train stations and your post offices and so on and so forth are easily recognizable as dating to the fascist era, if not always through insignia or slogans, but then through the design, you may be glad to have the building, even if you wish it were not so obviously, quote unquote, fascist, as dozens of people have told me in the course of countless conversations. I have heard disavowals of this kind, meaning the buildings are useful, but fascism is in the distant past and it is not related to us in the present. I've heard these disavowals articulated sincerely sometimes, many times, and at others, I have thought that they were perhaps made disingenuously, leaning towards what I, as a foreigner, was thought to prefer to hear. But in any case, it has usually been the fact of my asking that brought the fascist origins of the structure under discussion to the fore. In part for this reason, and in part for others I'm going to turn to soon, in my view, what makes legacies of fascism in Italy's built environment undesirable when they are undesired is largely the awareness of an outsider's gaze, particularly of foreigners. This, an outsider looking in and presumed to stand in judgment, is what poses a direct challenge to many Italians' sense of having achieved or recovered what Hashimoto calls a moral foothold. Location can also play a part, as I learned while I was collaborating on a documentary about Asmara, the capital of Italy's former colony, Eritrea. A UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2017, the city center is a unique showcase of Italian architecture, particularly dating to the years between 1934 and 1940, when the Italian population boomed because Asmara was used as a base from which to launch Italy's war on Ethiopia in 1935. Much of this architecture is rationalist. In other words, in vernacular terms, it, quote, looks fascist, in other words. While I was there in Asmara in 2001 and 2003, I heard Italian visitors comment to the effect that at home in Italy, they hated this architecture, but here they appreciated it more, they said. It's really quite beautiful. It's really not bad. It's very attractive. I understood from this that the architecture's political taint diminishes with distance from where Italians dwell, meaning from Italy itself. This conceptual removal makes it easier to see the architecture strictly for its aesthetic aspects, on the condition, of course, of overlooking the colonial hierarchies embedded in its origins. But ultimately, these remarks indicated to me that the desirability of such heritage is determined by a number of factors. It's not simply a fascist era origin that dictates Italian attitudes, but rather the perception of how strongly the edifice's continued presence reflects on Italian today. And that is determined by both who the interlocutor or observer is and where the edifices are. Vestiges are not in and of themselves problematic then, but instead become a source of friction when the politics of their origins are acknowledged from the outside. Only when that happens are, and I am generalizing, are Italians in general, or a municipal government, or the state called to account. In this respect, it is crucial to note that Italy has no Nuremberg, no site that is globally known to stand for evil. It is not just, as I mentioned before, that there is no Italian documentation center equivalent to Nuremberg's. It is also that no Italian place has a history that is as straightforwardly undesirable. Fascism's triumphalism was never so conveniently concentrated in one notorious spot, purposefully designed for that purpose. And as a result, no single Italian site can be treated medicinally or apotropaically once and for all. But even considering the diffusion of fascist traces throughout Italy, not many sites have garnered national discussion. Those that have are almost exclusively in Rome. I would add to that Bolzano, but mostly Rome, the city most thoroughly reshaped under fascist rule. In the words of historian Vittorio Vidotto, the whole of Rome is a fascist site. The Foro Italico, originally called Foro Mussolini, is the city's most obvious individual site, thanks excuse me, to its Duke's obelisk far in the background on the lower left hand, and its statues of athletes on the upper left hand, all of which are still standing. Before Italians even had a chance to debate the survival of the entire building complex of the Foro, it was the American armed forces that sheltered it from damage by using the building complex as a US Army rest center after the troops reached Rome in June of 1944. Italian discussion arose much later in the lead up to the 1960s Olympics. Anticipating the judgment of foreigners who would soon arrive, debates in the press heated up. Some protested the international and global impression that the stele would celebrating the fascist regime. So there's one in the middle on the top, but there are sort of 24 of them, celebrating the fascist regime, and the mosaics depicting bombardments in Ethiopia would make. Counter arguments included, speaking to my point here, that there's no reason to modify these things because foreigners had never objected to these before. These are the arguments made in the press in the late 1950s. A very few things were modified soon. The stele, which, okay, you can see the two rows on the lower left hand. A few were actually modified, moved around, and added There were some that were added because each of them had a text. Many of them still have these texts commemorating the stages of the fascist revolution, the party, and so on and so forth. And then there are a few added that are about post-fascism. But overall, as you can see from these images that celebrate the attack on Ethiopia, on the far right, those two, and the cult of the Duce more generally, the middle lower one and the further one on the right. So nothing really was removed or hidden. And the episode, the crisis of arguing over the optics, as we would now say, of the site, that was left behind. It has been discussed again, but only very periodically. And again, nothing has been modified. I see a direct continuity between the logic of those exchanges, right? This is a problem. No, it isn't, because no one has ever complained in the global or international press. I see a direct continuity between the logic of those exchanges and the strong Italian reactions against historian Ruth Bengiat's article of 2017 in the New Yorker, "Why Are So Many Fascist Monuments Still Standing in Italy?" It's shown a spotlight on this building, the Palazzo della Civiltà del Lavoro, which was previously called the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana in Rome's Eur district. I am confident that the same article published by an Italian in an Italian publication would have drawn some reaction, but very little in comparison to the largely defensive response received by Bengiat's article. Eminent historians of fascism and architecture published articles in every major Italian periodical to comment. Reactions on social media and email ran from enraged, often xenophobic aggression, in the large part, to occasional earnest explanations, even these being quite defensive. I should add that Professor Bengiat kindly shared with me a great deal of the material that she received, so I got to read it firsthand. In sum, it was a foreigner's gaze that prompted the most public national discussion yet of how to frame and how to treat the fascist heritage in Italy's built environment. One that Italian activists, meanwhile, strive to create and sustain without ever getting as much traction. And here I would use my prime example is Ijabashego. She's not alone, but there is an ongoing, as many of you know, there are several now movements that want to rename or remove or at least discuss a whole range of vestiges, but to my knowledge, none of them has ever attracted this much discussion. The responses to the Bengiat article generally invoked one of two lines of argument. The first one, which is an old one, it's been recurrent in architectural circles since after the war, positioned the, quote, goodness of rationalist architecture as an antidote to the badness of 1930s politics. So that's a familiar argument, and I'm not going to sort of go into it here. More relevant to my purposes here, the second argument made against Bengiat invoked heritage as a category that places whatever is in it beyond question. In his groundbreaking article of 2010 titled Fascism as Heritage, historian Joshua Arthurs showed how in the first post-1960 debates over the Foro Italico, which surfaced due to Berlusconi-era neo-fascist use of the Foro, among other things, the far right and heritage experts made common cause in favor of protecting fascist vestiges. As Arthurs put it, in quotes, heritagizing fascism's monumental remains offered uncritical legitimation and the valorization of a deeply troubling past. The reactions to Bengiat's article followed in this exact vein, claiming a kind of sacrosanctity for heritage. Of the numerous ways in which Italy's fascist heritage problems differ from Germany's Nazi heritage issues, this is perhaps the most important. Instead of a designation as heritage heightening difficulty, as MacDonald has shown it did for Nuremberg, in Italy it does the very opposite. The label of heritage places monuments like the Foro Italico beyond the reach of critique. We're going to the Agropontino. I'm assuming most of you know exactly where this is, but for those of you who don't, Rome is just above the top of this slide, and these are the 5 very much studied by architectural historians, the 5 new towns of the Agropontino, in English, the Pontine Marshes, all built in the 1930s. We're going to Sabaudia, which is the one at the bottom. In the new town of Sabaudia, built in the reclaimed Pontine Marshes in 1934, the church facade sports a huge vertical mosaic depicting Mary of the Annunciation. Not far from her, on a separate visual plane and on a smaller scale, is Mussolini, depicted as feeding freshly harvested wheat into a mechanical threshing machine. This is certainly an example of another difference between Italy and Germany. In Germany, we can be sure that we will not be coming across an open-air original Hitler in situ on a church facade. But I introduced the mosaic as a concrete example of how such a vestige could remain intact and in place while apparently becoming inoffensive, not difficult, but heritage all the same. Without delving into the details here, because they are many, I will note that the immediate protection of Mussolini's image, which was in general, the most often targeted fascist symbol in the immediate aftermath of Mussolini's fall, was actually his face. So this is really an exceptional case. The immediate protection of the image was owed to the parish priest. We know this from local sources. He ran up to stop vandalism as it was about to occur. Some post-war discussion ensued in the press as to whether or not this should be considered an artifact too obscene to preserve, but no change transpired. And by 1974, when Pier Paolo Pasolini, one of Italy's most important bona fide leftists, referred to Sabaudia as not really fascist and more in tune with De Chirico's metaphysical paintings, he was one of, let's say, several people who gave their imprimatur to a perception of the image, this image of Mussolini, along with the whole town of Sabaudia, as permanently defascistized. So many of you probably know this. If you go on YouTube, you can find this clip. Here's Pasolini on the dunes of Sabaudia. It's part of a longer set of scenes. And he's talking about cities, but he specifically says these things: una città ridicola fascista, ci sembra così incantevole. So he's completely defanged, let's say, whatever fascist charge may have been left in this image. And I want to add, of course, that this is part of, he shared ownership of a villa, or the lease on a villa, with Moravia, really close by on the dunes. And this was the time when Rome was in part Hollywood on the Tiber, and so many intelligentsia members, as well as prominent figures in the arts, spent time there, and indeed found Sabaudia pretty, which it is, and the setting lovely. I call this an example of inertia memoriae, inertia of memory. I use this expression first because it is clearly the opposite of damnatio memoriae. The examples on the screen are of that. The practice regimes in ancient Egypt and Rome engaged in of deleting or attacking, damaging the traces of previous rulers. This could be limited to scratching out the eyes of relief figures, as was done to Queen Hatshepsut in Egypt, or it might extend to removing their names from monuments, as happened with Nero. Many fascist symbols were quickly destroyed immediately after Mussolini's fall, but this particular image of Mussolini and Sabaudia survived that onslaught of 1943, and it survived World War II, and it remained in place, never modified and never hidden. Sabaudia still hosts many visitors due to its proximity to the beach as well as to Rome, so there's no question that many people have seen the mosaic. It also makes quick appearances in like a Lina Wertmuller film. I mean, it shows up from time to time. Any number of opportunities must have arisen for protest, discussion, and potentially for modifying the image, but it has long since been framed as heritage, which prevents it from causing trouble. Locals point out that since Mussolini actually did participate in harvesting days in the area, the scene merely depicts a local historical event. This reason would suggest that it is something of a family portrait, a yellowing photographic print that could not possibly denote anything sinister. If pressed, many locals might even argue that the Pontine Marshes reclamation stood out as the most beneficial accomplishment of Italian fascism, and that the Mussolini portrayed here is a good one, a good Mussolini. We, in turn, could say that those not anti-fascist locals benefit from the idea of heritage as a fig leaf. In any case, local signage emphasizes the heritage aspects of the church. There are signs on the way into Sabada, there's signage in front of the church. It's all about patrimonio architettonico. So it's unambiguously framed as desirable. The rationalist design of the church was the work of a team led by architect Luigi Piccinato, who had a prominent career after the war and managed to sort of remove fascist associations from his name. And so labeling the church as heritage and the facade of the church as heritage helps to impede further discussion. My use of inertia in this sense is self-evident, referring both to a lack of change and a staying in place. But the term also has a second meaning that is less prevalent in usage. In the field of physics, inertia is also defined as a property of matter by which it continues in its existing state of rest or its uniform motion in a straight line, unless that state is changed by an external force. In this aspect of the term's meaning, we can see inertia in Inertia Memoriae as describing the pattern of political charge diminishing as the object sits unmodified, but being revived, stimulated by outsiders' attention, by external force. Questioning what to do with fascist vestiges, in which case the sort of political charge drums up again. All right, I'm entering the last part of my paper. I study Italian heritage and fascism and the survival of monuments, but rather than seeing myself as a critic, I'm an anthropologist aiming to understand how Italian culture works. In this role, I am above all aware of Italians' own self-recriminations regarding fascist heritage. When Italians aim to draw attention to the colonial past or fascist crimes and hypocrisies in the treatment of refugees today, many Italian commentators place heavy blame on Italians themselves, accusing them implicitly or explicitly of moral weakness, and yet reserving for themselves the right to make those accusations against other Italians. Historian Silvana Patriarca's 2010 study of this very phenomenon, Italian vices, cites the prominent journalist Indro Montanelli, who died in 2001 and has recently been the target of severe criticism himself. She quotes him as writing that only as an Italian could he criticize the Italians. This fits, of course, with the tendency mentioned above to react with extra vehemence against the gaze of outsiders, precisely because outside criticism is unacceptable. There are two long-standing anthropological concepts that could be invoked to describe how Italians respond to outsiders' discussion of uncomfortable fascist heritage, or in my terms, of how their inertia reacts to the application of external force. One of these concepts is Ruth Benedict's distinction between guilt cultures and shame cultures in her 1946 work on Japan in the immediate wake of World War II. Benedict did not place Italy in the shame culture category, but as observers of Italian reactions to outsiders' probing remarks, we may nonetheless find some familiarity in, this is a quote, a discomfort that cannot be relieved as guilt can be by confession and atonement, but rather must be suffered for as long as the shamed version of the self endures, end quote. The other familiar anthropological formulation, one that has always included Italy, unlike the guilt and shame culture discussion, is the so-called honor-shame complex, which, although rather discredited by now as a set of traditional values unifying the Mediterranean basin into a single culture area, as was discussed in the 1970s, still appears throughout discussions in multiple disciplines. According to this view, criticisms from outside Italy would be understood as not only shaming, but entailing a concomitant loss of honor. For us to explore this through and through, however, would require distorting the record, if not in the use of the idea of shame. It is fair to say that some of the reactions to Bengiat's article were those of people who felt they had been shamed, albeit unjustly. Then in the use of the word honor, which, after all, no one has tried to restore as a result of being shamed regarding fascist vestiges. Still, from my perspective, both of these possible anthropological labels, shame culture and honor-shame complex, ring as judgmental regardless of how objective they seemed in the past. Hence my preference for Inertia Memoriae, which aims to describe a pattern of inaction and or reactive action rather than the sentiments or the social dispositions that drive the pattern. We can observe, simply put, that many fascist vestiges remain in place and that discussion of them becomes animated when external factors come into play. Analytically, the expression has to its advantage that it not only describes behaviors and their results, but it also encompasses affective memorial investments that remain high, as in Mussolini's cryptic Predapio, where the emotional charge is boosted routinely by the external interventions of visits and rituals, as well as objects that have become drained of political life despite staying in place, such as the Mussolini in Sabada's mosaic. And that's why I like the term, because it can encompass the high charge and the low charge. Inertia Memoriae, in short, has the breadth as a category for scholars to include the whole range of what often looks like Italians' vacillation between rejecting fascism and its traces, on the one hand, and coexisting contentedly with, or at least having a high tolerance for, the symbols of fascism in their midst, on the other hand. For Italians themselves, more importantly, I want to suggest that this ability to move from apparent passivity to agitation and back, according to the pressures of the moment, which Italians occasionally condemn as moral weakness in themselves and each other, or as ambivalence. Instead, I want to suggest that this ability may well be the stance that is most effective at keeping the peace among Italians. Fixing one meaning or another permanently, especially if it means deciding that a symbol, that any symbol forever retains its fascist charge, could prove to reinforce divisions in Italian society that are still unhealed as it is. Bringing conflicting views out into the open would require moving into the realm of what geographers Gregory Ashworth and John Tunbridge called dissonant heritage, delving into fully explicit discussions of divergent narratives, or what Hashimoto calls moral frames, in order to reach consensus or at least some level of reconciliation. This would be an extremely worthy goal, but it would also likely be a very deeply difficult process in the sense in which MacDonald uses the word difficult. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation.